National conservatism reminds us that the nation-state is the building block of all international order. It is legitimate and it has consent from the people it governs. But it is perhaps worth delving a little further into why national and why conservative. If you look back in history, there has long been a tension between nationalism and internationalism. In the medieval world, there was a hope that there would be a universal state, probably with strong direction from the Church, which would bring all Christian governments together. Interestingly, and I think importantly, this wasn't the view of St. Thomas Aquinas, whose political work focused on the state, and in his fundamentally important explanation of a just war, he made it clear that legitimate authority belongs to the state rather than to some ethereal international organization. The attempts to create overriding states all fail throughout history. So the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne dispersed under his grandchildren. The Emperor Charles V found that his state had to be divided up after his death between his son and his brother. And we all know and rejoice at the fact that Napoleon came crashing down at Waterloo. And this reaffirms the acceptance of the state itself, established since the Treaty of Westphalia at the least, which settled the 30 Years' War. It is from this that the idea of international law develops. But these are not laws applied to states by a higher authority. They are laws that states apply to themselves to maintain the authority of the nation. This makes intuitive sense because the state is a natural extension of society in which the family comes first. There is often a tension between the state and the family. We see in communist regimes particularly a hatred for the family because the family is an alternative power base. It is in its way a mini-state, which is how Aquinas described it. And that power block is one that garners the loyalty of individuals. But in a conservative nation, power comes from the bottom up. It comes from individuals who are in families, and those families come together to create communities, and communities create a state. The nation, then, is a human, organic body that grows from those who are a part of it. The distinction is with an international order that is top-down, heavy-handed, and imposed by the strong. That is to say, by those who are already in power upon the weak, those who are powerless. As the nation-state is organic and grows up from people, it is also limited in what it can do. Although the theory of parliamentary sovereignty, Dicey's theory, would have you believe that an act of parliament can do anything, it is bound in by some idea of natural law. It cannot, for example, abolish the family. This is the link to the ideas of the nation-state that have come to us from the great thinkers. The state as it has grown up in England, the United Kingdom, and then in nations that have followed our practices, is one where the state as represented by the king is clearly under the law rather than being above or actually being the law. This also comes, interestingly, from Aquinas, who said that whoever enacts a law for another should apply the same law to himself, and that a ruler is not free from the directive power of the law. This is taken up very importantly by Sir John Fortescue, whose magnificent 15th century political works set out a vision of the English nation-state that still exists today and is at the heart of why we had to leave the European Union. Fortescue explained the difference between the English monarchy and the French monarchy. The fundamental difference being that the English king is under the law, whereas the French king is the law. This leads... Oh, thank you. Somebody agrees with me. I'm very glad to hear it. There should be a prize to the gentleman in the front for paying such close attention, so let me repeat the point. Was it a lady? I'm saying I can't see for the bright lights. Thank you. Round of applause for the lady. Fortescue explained the difference between the English monarchy and the French monarchy, the fundamental difference being that the English king is under the law, whereas the French king is the law. And this leads to enormous advantages for us, because it underpins the rights of property, again strongly supported by Aquinas, which allows people to invest, to improve the yield from their land, and to keep the fruits of their labour without having it arbitrarily confiscated or their practices unreasonably regulated. This understanding of what the state is about is fundamental to the British vision of ourselves as a nation. Naturally, Edmund Burke, and how suitable that this conference is under the auspices of the Edmund Burke Foundation, took up the theme. Burke understood the stability of England as opposed to the revolutionaries' activities in France. His reflections on the revolution in France is a foundational conservative work because it makes the case for avoiding violent revolutions, which destabilize not just in the short term, but over generations. The continuity of a nation-state is fundamental to its success. A limited state that honors traditions and is based on individual rights, and particularly the family. That is what has shone through the English and subsequently the United Kingdom nation-state. We have a constitution based on the rights of property, democracy, the rule of law, and freedom of speech. Indeed, as we noticed a few moments ago, freedom of speech, even when it's slightly irritating. And these can be traced back to antiquity. Indeed, and I was thinking about this particularly at the Constitution, but indeed many of our institutions, at least in some form, predate the Norman Conquest. In 1215, when Magna Carta was granted by King John, the barons were maintaining that they were simply safeguarding the rights that had been given to them by Edward the Confessor. In 1297, one of the most important and most forgotten acts of Parliament, that is still the law of the land today, is the statute concerning tallage. Do you know what that does? Nobody knows. Even in this audience, it requires democratic consent for taxation. This has been on our statute book for over 700 years. The American cry of no taxation without representation was one that, though they did not formulate it, would have been known in effect to our 13th century forebears. And fascinatingly, just after this act has passed, in the early 14th century, we know that many petitions were presented to Parliament, a lot of them have survived, which then became legislation, writing grievances that the people of the country were seen to have. So the power to grant taxation led directly to a demand for and a receipt of redress of grievance with a democratic mandate at the beginning of the 14th century. It's absolutely extraordinary the length of this tradition. So just jumping forward a few hundred years to 1679, once again we found with habeas corpus, it's a confirmation of rights. It's not a grant of a new and revolutionary right. It is putting into statute something that people believed they already had. With 1688, the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech in Parliament, again a confirmation of a right that people had claimed for many years before. So by 1688, this country had rights of property, the rule of law, and freedom of speech. However, democracy was still limited, restricted to people with a certain amount of money. And from 1688 to 1832, democracy didn't really increase. If anything, it probably decreased slightly. But from 1832, it started growing again. And perhaps most importantly, it is extended in 1867 by Disraeli, who sees that the people of the country will enjoy the stability of the country. The 1867 Act was very much Disraeli's act. He wanted a wide extension of the franchise. He wrote about this in his early novels, and it was not merely a tactic to upset Gladstone. Tempting though that may have been, it was something he had thought throughout his political career. He saw that the stability of the country rested upon allowing working men to vote, and he believed that he could bind them into the stability and mystery of the British Constitution. So you've got all four pillars really firmly established, and of course throughout this period we have considerable and growing prosperity. But in 1972, annus horribilis, as Her late Majesty might have called it, we took a slight detour, rectified by the referendum in the year of 2016, the glorious fructification of the view of the British people that they are a free people and that these superstates do not work. This is a reassertion of self-confidence, of belief that the nation-state is the right unit for government based on our history and based on those great thinkers. The nation-state, back in fashion, offering a chance of good government. Unfortunately, whilst within the United Kingdom the nation-state is strong and much reinvigorated post-Brexit, after Tony Blair's period of office, some Conservatives decided that we could only win as a quasi-social democrat party. Hence a refusal to challenge the quangocracy, with too much of our national life directed by unelected officials rather than accountable through Parliament. Conservatism lost faith in itself and didn't win a decent majority until 2019. It is not until 2019, with Boris Johnson, that there was a Conservative majority that may be able to do things. And it did one great thing, that is, it got Brexit done, reinvigorating the nation-state. But it was then knocked for six by COVID. So what should the Conservatives be doing, and how should we make our belief a popular one again? First of all, we should look at the principles that we hold. Are the principles of conservatism attractive? And the answer must be yes. We believe that individuals should have control of their own lives. We believe that the state is built from the bottom up. We believe that the line that the man in Whitehall really does know best is not only wrong, but is desperately condescending. So how do we put this into practice? Well, we try and maintain individual freedom as far as we can. This ties into taxation. How is it that a Conservative government has the highest rate of taxation as a percent of GDP in 70 years? This is not just because of COVID. It was moving in that direction beforehand. It was because of choices that we have made. Do we think that the state should be taking charge of more aspects of people's lives and leaving them less freedom of choice? We have seen this recently, and what Miriam was saying to you earlier was so brilliant. I was very reassured that having lots of children doesn't axiomatically mean you are right-wing. I have 6 children and I am right-wing, but the two are not necessarily correlated. The state will now pay anybody to look after your children other than the parents of the children. It won't offer any tax support. Indeed, you are penalised heavily by the state if you try to look after your own children. This is fundamentally anti-conservative. It is anti the family. It is hostile to the building block of society that Conservatives should concentrate on. Now, this is difficult territory for us because in the 1990s, the Conservatives under John Major had a back-to-basics policy that it was at least portrayed, accurately or not, as condemnatory of people who led different lifestyles or of single-parent families. And it made the Tory party look as if it was a negative force rather than a positive force in terms of family policy. And we must avoid that. But we ought to support families through the tax and benefit system and through legislation. And we should rely on families to make more choices rather than fewer for their children. What do I mean by this? Well, there are those heartrending cases when parents want to take their children, when seriously ill, abroad for experimental treatments. That is a decision best made by the parents, not by the state, not by the courts. Parents have a greater love for their children than any judge, however noble, however worthy, however bewigged, could ever possibly have. We should not interfere. We should let parents make decisions. We should not have a benefit system where people are penalised for getting married. We should not have a tax system that makes you poorer when you get married. Almost nobody is better off in tax or benefit terms through marriage in this country. That is an anti-family policy, shockingly operated by Conservatives. Support for the family is a fundamental Conservative principle, and it is where our support is likely to come from. The Conservatives ought also to be more in favour of accountability and less of the bureaucratic state. Now, New Labour was tremendously clever about this. You have to give that to them. It set up a wide range of quangos and said, we won't appoint these grubby politicians to run them. We will appoint high-minded people to make decisions above and beyond day-to-day party politics. They then, of course, proceeded to fill these quangos up with copper-bottomed lefties and set up an appointment system that would do the same. Now, we have this ridiculous body called HOLAC, House of Lords Appointments Committee, that constrains the royal prerogative in the appointment of peers. It doesn't appoint any better peers, it just stops some people that HOLAC is snooty about getting into the House of Lords. And I happen to think, this isn't in my text, but I'm going to say it anyway, that their veto of Paul Dacre is an outrage. That somebody who has run a newspaper loved by millions of our fellow citizens, and they are snooty and snobbish about the Daily Mail. And HOLAC should be ashamed of itself for thinking that somebody like that is not worthy of a peerage when you look at some of the ermine wearers that we've currently got. It's absolutely monstrous. But it's also entirely democratically unaccountable. Whereas a Prime Minister exercising the royal prerogative, or strictly speaking advising the King to exercise the royal prerogative, is accountable to the voters. But we see the same with the bungling Bank of England. I think that's what it's been renamed. It's BB rather than simply Bank of England. It's bungling Bank of England. Its monetary policy has been muddled now for years, keeping zombie firms afloat and making it harder to own a home, yet it will be an elected government that gets the blame for the ineptitude of unelected real policymakers. Voters will understandably say that Mr Hunt is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that the government of the day is responsible, and I am worse off today than I was last year, so thank you very much, but I'm not going to vote for you. And this is closely related to Brexit, because the European Union was structured on the quango state. Bodies like the Environment Agency were plugged into the quango state in Brussels and severed from accountable British government. This was the whole point. With decision-making centralised in Brussels, the wiring went from Brussels to the plug, where the British agency was plugged in. Once we left the European Union, the agency was unplugged, with the wiring left unconnected to anything else. You've got this sort of plug waving around, not able to link into anything. So it's now unaccountable, gets no source of direction from either a democratic or a bureaucratic state. But Brexit ought to be a time for great Conservative opportunities based on democratic accountability. We must move away from the quango state and take powers back to ministers who are accountable and, if they get things wrong, can be removed from office by the electorate, or indeed by the House of Commons on behalf of the electorate. Now, what opportunities are there with Brexit? Well, the first must be free trade. Free trade helps importer and exporter countries. If we open our markets, we will find that prices in the UK will fall. And it's on the side of the consumer, the family, the voter, not the producer interest that we support free trade. And prices fall not just because tariffs have been removed, but because regulations have been eased. They will fall because we will create a fundamentally more competitive economy. We will allocate resources where we have a competitive advantage. Consumers will have more money in their pockets to buy more goods and services, and consumers and businesses will both be better off. Protectionism is a poor system of guiding an economy. It's what the European Union wants to do. It hurts the consumer to the benefit of a small number of monopolistic producers. And that's what the EU is all about, protecting a small number of monopolistic producers. And anyone who doesn't believe me should just look at the diesel scandal that was all about protecting the German car industry at the cost of the health not the wealth of consumers across the European Union. So we should be aggressive about free trade and recognise that there is no need for us to follow the European Union's self-harm. One ridiculous proposal we managed to fight off last year was that dairy products coming from the EU should be inspected by a vet in case they are dangerous. Now, the EU is over-regulated, not under-regulated. One thing you can say for EU countries is that they do know how to make cheese safely. Now, if you come from Somerset, you may think that cheddar cheese is infinitely preferable and you don't want to bother with all these funny cheeses from the continent, but you may take a different view and you should be entitled to do so, and you will know that the cheese, however pongy, has been safely ponged. And these goods are safe, and having these extra checks would simply put prices up. Exactly what industry has been complaining about within the last few days. We have higher inflation because we are imposing extra regulations on business. Free trade should be our starting point. Less burdensome regulation flows from it. And the list that has come from the government of what it will get rid of with the retained EU law bill seems to me as if it could have been drawn up by Baldrick. It will, well, let me just do a survey to the extent I can. Are there any people here who transport carnations from Japan to the Netherlands? None of you? I'm so disappointed. Or any anchovy traders? Not a single solitary anchovy traded by any of you. Well, you'll be so disappointed. Anyone from Mauritania? No, apparently lots of regulations relating to Mauritania, and I don't have a single Mauritanian to congratulate on this newfound liberty that His Majesty's government has given you. But you still can't go to a butcher and buy a bone to give your dog, because we're keeping that regulation clearly essential to the state and security of the nation. And these reforms are so pathetically unambitious. We are removing things that are mainly OTOs that would have been got rid of by the sunset, which was the whole point of the sunset in the first place. But the opportunity for the country is supply-side reforms, and I'm lucky I'm speaking before lunch, because if I were in the after-lunch session, as soon as I mentioned supply-side reforms, the snoring would reach a volume that would be deafening. But supply-side reforms are important because it means cheaper goods. And what do you want when there's an inflationary problem? Cheaper goods. How do you defeat inflation? Monetary policy and supply-side reforms, which we now call cheaper goods. Because it's the nation-state that is the foundation of democratic legitimacy. It's why it's important that we take these opportunities that Brexit can give us. And I'm worried that because we've abandoned the ambition of the rule bill, despite the clear promise of the Prime Minister, this will mean a failure to grasp the economic gains Brexit can give us, but also, following the Windsor framework, that we once again simply shadow the European Union. But, I'll be very clear about this, after changing leader twice, it was and is conservative and essential to support this government. Yes, it needs to be more ambitious, but also we must support it because the alternative is far worse. But in terms of ambition, if we look at the last budget, other than the recognition of non-European medicine regulators, which is important, the budget could have been delivered by Rachel Reeves. And the filleting of the rule bill, which Boris Johnson was determined to push through, is not simply totemic. It is not Eurosceptic whimsy, but will leave the United Kingdom tied to EU regulations that are helping cause a decline in prosperity across Europe. We will effectively remain within the regulatory ambit of the European Union as it hampers the capacity of businesses to compete and innovate, the very things on which prosperity depends. This U-turn is a defeat for ambition, prosperity and democracy. And as I said, Rishi Sunak made a specific promise to scrap thousands of EU laws. There's a little video with a shredder working overtime, but he's broken that promise. And this is very unfortunate, as one of his virtues is his trustworthiness, and the surrender to the blob risks exposing the government to ridicule, the ridicule particularly of the anchovy traders, I think. It also risks making us poorer, because restoring economic growth is vital. Britain's sovereign, parliamentary, constitutional settlement is the way to get to prosperity. But it needs to be used. It won't be if the governing philosophy of the Conservatives in power is simply taking official advice. That advice is designed to maintain EU regulations which were crafted in Brussels largely for big corporations. These rules are crushing the innovative smaller enterprises who ought to be our economic future. If this continues, the outcome will be simple. The United Kingdom, His Majesty's subjects, will be poorer. And the Bank of England, which I've already mentioned, has been tightening monetary policy, and that is difficult for people. But the government's getting blamed and isn't doing the concomitant that would make life easier, the supply-side reforms, and maybe making things worse. I don't know if you've heard of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a straightforward example of protectionism, which will only serve to make goods more expensive. And we have a crazy energy policy, and we are not looking to national interest. We are piling palayan upon ossa in terms of green regulations. We already have the highest energy prices in Europe for industry, 25% of which come from green imposts. And we're about to add yet more through the energy bill that is wending its way through Parliament. We put charges on industry, then the industry leaves the United Kingdom, so as a result we're planning to tax imports from these countries through the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It is statism upon statism, and it would be much easier to allow our domestic industries to have cheaper energy, which we can and do produce. But we then put charges on it to make our industries, our own industries, deliberately inefficient, and then we want to make the costs higher for consumers by applying that to everybody else. This is a downward spiral. Thank you. This is a downward spiral that will make us poorer, and what we need to be doing is making the country richer. We must look at whether net zero by 2050 is feasible. It is no good willing the end before having calculated the economic cost of the means. Ultimately, nobody gets elected on making voters cold and poor. But we must also tackle our planning system. The system is blighting the economy of the nation and is fundamentally unconservative. It believes that Whitehall can guide and direct planning throughout the country and that local town halls know what is best for their communities. They don't. Individuals do. Also, it undermines the rights of property. We need much more permitted development. We need to have a planning system that allows us to build the houses we need for our existing population. And this alone, and you will hear later from the brilliant, inspirational Suella Braverman, who is so right about this, but this alone shows that we cannot continue to bring in hundreds of thousands of more people into our country every year. We do not have the houses for them. But we also have a planning system that means businesses cannot expand their factories, cannot expand their offices. They're tied in by heavy restrictions on the use of their properties and costly long-term delays because of planners who are still working, is the word I've got in my text. Whether it's the right one or not, I'm not sure, but let's say working from home a long time after COVID ceased to be a threat. This is how a dysfunctional state works against the interests of the nation. Planning is, of course, one of the two great remaining pillars of the socialist state built in the 1940s. The other, normally unmentionable in conservative circles, is the National Health Service. And you'll understand why I'm a little bit more cautious in talking about reform here, because it's often seen as a Labour Party project. But when somebody like Labour's Wes Streeting starts saying that reform is needed and then gets pilloried by some on the hard left, it is a conversation that we need to have. And we should look at it from the point of view of choice. There are other models around the world that provide people with better outcomes at lower cost and give them more choice. And the Australian example is one I think many Conservatives find attractive. So, from a Conservative point of view, it is a mixed picture. We have won the nation state. There is no prospect of the UK going back into the United Kingdom, and the gerrymandering effort you've read about today of Keir Starmer giving votes to all the EU nationals here would not get us back into the European Union. It's fanciful to think that. It's a particularly silly scheme. I very much doubt they'll do it in the end. Parties that try and gerrymander end up finding that their clever scheme comes back to bite them, as, dare I say, we found by insisting on voter ID for elections, and we found that the people who didn't have ID were elderly, and they by and large voted Conservative. So we made it hard for our own voters, and we upset a system that worked perfectly well. It was one of the glories of our country, actually, that we did on an honesty basis when the real problem is with postal voting. So don't get too fretful about random schemes brought up by the socialists, because gerrymandering doesn't really work. So there's no prospect of going back into the European Union, and our democracy is more vibrant because of that. We have won back the means of governing, even if that has left too much power in the hands of quangocrats. But that can now be reversed by Act of Parliament without a superior body saying no. That is a restoration of our very nation, a triumph for Conservatives and conservatism in this country. That is also the constitutional foundation for the policies we need to implement. Conservatism has slipped from the forefront of policy making in recent years. We have not taken the benefits of Brexit to reform how our economy works, to make people more prosperous, because our children, and this should be our ambition, should have a better standard of living than we have, and their children a better standard of living than they have. The Green Agenda in its current form is harming living standards and making people poorer, and will do for future generations. We have accepted dependency on the state, which it will be difficult to wean people off. We have a planning system that is sclerotic and squeezes out economic growth. These are great challenges for Conservatives. But this conference has come to the United Kingdom following our historic and momentous rejuvenation of the nation-state, the fundamental part of democratic government itself. Aquinas, Fortescue and Burke would be proud of us and would recognise what we achieved together when we got Brexit done. I think I'm the first person to claim Aquinas as a Brexiteer. Look at me. It may surprise some Catholic theologians, but I'm going to claim him as a Brexiteer anyway. But the racetrack of the nation-state is sound. If we stay on the Conservative horse, we will find that after the jumps, we have to navigate. The going is good. If government has entered a listless and bureaucratic phase once more, perhaps this is a natural hiatus, as Conservatives now pause for breath after the stunning achievement of Brexit. But let us have the debates as we're having here today that will allow us to be refreshed, rejuvenated, and ready to continue the vital work of restoring the sovereign, democratic, free and prosperous British nation-state. That is our challenge. It's an extraordinarily exciting one. The explosion of ideas will give us an opportunity to make this country stronger, better, and more prosperous, generation after generation.